Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I begin in the name of the God whose mercy is profound, whose kindness is forever. This is uh, our fourth session on the topic of discovering Islam, which is a presentation um, comprised of two sessions. The first one is on an important topic regarding understanding Islam. And the second of the two is the reading of the Quran. So we are going through the process of learning about the Quran in a sequence. So let me start with the first one. In the first two sessions, we talked about the coherence in the Quran, what is called Nazm Quran. In the third session, that is the last session, I started the understanding of a few prerequisites for reading the Quran. There are certain prerequisites, requirements, expectations, which a reader of the Quran should meet in order for him to be able to understand the Quran properly. I was able to discuss two of them in the last session. One was that I mentioned that the Quran should always be read for the purpose of seeking guidance and for no other purpose. And while describing this particular prerequisite, I mentioned that when we read the Quran and understand it, we should give it top priority. Every other effort should be secondary. It's only then that you can hope to understand the Quran properly. And indeed, the Quran deserves this attitude on our behalf. The second condition that I mentioned was that we should read the Quran with deep reflection called tadabbur. And while doing this exercise, we should bear in mind that the Quran makes a very strong claim that because it's the Almighty's message, it has no contradictions in its text. So while we are doing this exercise of reading the Quran with deep reflection, as and when we confront apparent contradictions, which we would most certainly, we should not lose hope and give it up, but should find all such occasions, passages, the real areas of challenge for us to delve into the text even more deeply. And you will find amazing wisdom behind the apparent contradictions. So then I went on to mention the second condition, and that was that we should be aware of the benefits of reading the Quran regularly with understanding. And I mentioned that one of the greatest benefits that we can derive out of reading the Quran is that we get in direct contact with our Creator. It is His text. And when we read His text, we find that we are actually either listening to what He has said or at times we are talking to Him. Because quite often we would want to talk to Him. When we understand what He's saying, we feel like expressing ourselves before Him. So contact with God is the biggest benefit. The real, genuine contact with God is what you derive. The other thing that I mentioned was that when you read the Quran properly, carefully, genuinely, you are able to get an akhirat-based life. I'm not saying that you would always be successful in achieving it, but there's going to be a definite inclination. Why? Because that is exactly what the Quran keeps emphasizing. I mean, if you're going to do it with an understanding, how would you ignore it? The third important advantage you will derive when you will read the Quran regularly and carefully is that you can't miss the opportunity of having a very special relationship with Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, because the Quran is a communication between the Creator and the Messenger. And honest to God, you cannot find that kind of understanding, appreciation, feeling while going through any book of on Sirah, because this is the purest of the pure and a communication between the Almighty and the Messenger. That indeed is, again, a great benefit. The fourth thing I mentioned was that you will get a deep confidence, quiet, subtle, humble confidence that this indeed is God's book. And this would be accompanied by a feeling of contentment. I think I've sold the idea well. I mean, what else would you want to have in this world? Contact with the Almighty, an akhirat-based life, an appreciation of what the Prophet ﷺ went through in his life as a prophet, and then confidence and contentment. There's another point that I've added later, which some people might think that it's probably a negative point, but honestly, it is something that you get over a period of time when you start reading the Quran. Sometimes, many times, you actually start worrying. You start worrying about yourself. You start worrying about your close ones. And you start worrying about the people at large. This is the book which is telling you about the Almighty's plan, the grand plan for this life and the next life. And, when you start getting this feeling realization, people don't know about it. My goodness, you honestly get worried. Even the Muslims don't know about it. They read it for various different purposes, for sawab, for God knows barakah and whatnot. So you do get worried. And this is a very good worry. It's really a worry that every good human being should have. And let me say, this is a worry which the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam had all throughout his 23 years of the mission that he went through. So these are the advantages. Now, the third important prerequisite for you to be able to understand the Quran is to realize. And I tell you, without understanding this condition, this prerequisite, you will not be able to achieve the purpose of understanding the Quran properly. That the Quran is a saga of the messenger's mission. Call it story. Sarguzishti Zar. Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam was asked by the Almighty to warn the people of his community, of his town and surroundings. لِتُنْزِرَ أُمَّ الْقُرَى وَمَنْ حَوْلَهَا. Honestly, the words, they're so effective, strong, that at times, you feel that you're getting affected. That, oh, Prophet, we have given you this message so that you should warn through it to the people who belong to the city of Mecca and the surroundings. And the surrounding means everybody around it, all throughout the globe. So what the Almighty did was that he has been doing in the past as well, that he picked a few humans, the most outstanding amongst them, as his messenger prophets. I mean, as Rasul and Nabi. He picked some outstanding humans as Nabi who got the privilege of receiving divine revelation directly. But from within the bigger group of bigger superset of Anbiya there were a few who got the privilege of being Rasul. They were the ones who were given the task to ultimately present the message to their nation in a way that if they were to accept that message, they would succeed in this life as well as in the next one. But if they would refuse to accept the message, then they are going to be doomed, not just in the next life, but in this life as well. They're going to be punished. And the Quran talks about the punishments that were inflicted upon the nations who received the messages of the messengers and continued to reject them. This happened, this all important part of the Almighty's grand plan of this life, of this world. It happened for the last and the final time through Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So what he did was inzar, warning. He warned his people about the life hereafter that is round the corner. And he warned his immediate nation about the punishment that would come even before that. Within the lifetime of these people, they're going to be destroyed. They're not going to be spared. That is why you see the Quran keeps repeating the stories of at least 6 messengers, prominent messengers, over and over again. Nuh, Hud, Saleh, Lut, Shoaib, and Musa alayhi salam. The reason was that there was another punishment that was just round the corner, and the people had to be warned about it. In the mornings, in the afternoons, in the evenings, they were to be warned individually, they were to be warned collectively. This is, if you want to get an understanding of what happened and what was the kind of environment, read Surah Nuh, 71st surah, and you'll find that one great messenger, how he warned people, individually, collectively, during daytime, at night, so on. So this happened for the last time through the last prophet. And you know what? It was done by the Almighty to ensure, apart from many other goals that were sought to be achieved, to ensure that people living in this life, they should be able to know that there is going to be a life hereafter. These stories of the messengers and the destruction of their nations was actually an evidence of the reality that the life hereafter is indeed going to happen. Probably I'll talk more about it when I talk about the life hereafter, but just to briefly introduce you to the idea. Life hereafter is a concept. Call it a philosophical concept. It has certain arguments. I mean, if you read the Quran, you would find that the Quran is telling us that the life hereafter ought to happen. I mean, there is no reason why it should not happen. The Quran says that the life hereafter is possible. God can recreate humans after they're going to be dead. But you still have a feeling that, okay, I mean, who's seen it? Nobody has seen it. After all, it's just an idea. Okay, supported by arguments, but they are just intellectual arguments. The Almighty went ahead to actually show it practically through certain things, certain events that took place in the history of mankind, that this has been done even in this life. There have been miniature days of judgment that took place in this life, in the history of mankind. And this actually happened for the last time in the life of the last prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. What is the Quran? If you read the Quran and you want to understand what exactly is its subject matter from A to Z, it is this particular, target goal, that the Almighty guided the Prophet to warn these people, or else they are going to meet with punishment. And this happened over a period of 23 years. And if you want to know what the Quran is actually the saga, the story, the description of the warning that was given to a nation. And they all met with their fate in this very life. So what happens, the remarkable thing that happens during the life of the messengers is that what is normally promised to human beings in the next life is actually made to happen in this very life, for the nation of the messengers who receive the message directly. So, as a consequence, what we find is that the Quran, when you read the Quran, you ought to know that it's the saga of that mission. And this mission was accompanied in a way that the Prophet went through 6 stages in his life. Obviously, it happened through the process went through certain sequence. So the first of them was what we call specific warning inzar. The second was warning to all, inzar aam. The third was conclusive evidence was presented that could not be refuted, which is called itmamul hujjah. That is evidence that cannot be refuted. The fourth part of the mission was renouncing and migrating. Hijrat, Barat. The nation was informed that, you are not prepared to accept. You are a gone case. We now have nothing to do with you. And then the Prophet migrates. The fifth is what we call purification and cleansing. Tazkiyah, Tatheer. That is, individually, all the companions of the Prophet were cleansed morally, call it spiritually, right? That is the ultimate purpose of religion, so that we are all purified. We all go through the process of tazkiyah, so that we become eligible for the all-important life of the paradise, which is going to last forever. That was done in the case of the companions of the Prophet. But there were people who were a part of that group, but didn't deserve it. So they were separated. So it's tatheer as well, cleansing of the group. Because the punishment that was ultimately inflicted upon the enemies, the rejectors of the truth, the kuffar, was in this particular case to be inflicted through the hands, through the military might, through the swords of the companions. So that group had to be purified, had to be cleansed, so that there should not remain anyone who didn't deserve to be there. So that process was done. And finally, the last part, the sixth part, is punishment, azab. The nation that was to receive the message had to be punished. This was something that was mentioned right from the beginning. Now, these 6 stages of the process of inzar, of warning, took place. And when you read the Quran, any passage, it would belong to one phase of the prophetic mission or another. So if you are able to figure out and then read it, you will get the real proper understanding of what the Quran is doing and what stage of the Prophet's life is it relevant to. And obviously, it's always in a sequence. And as I mentioned in my earlier presentation regarding the coherence in the Quran, I mentioned that the Quran has been divided into 7 groups, such that Each group has one or more Meccan surahs to begin with at the beginning, and it's followed by one or several Madinan surahs. So it's Meccan Madinan surahs 7 times mentioned in a certain logical, wise sequence. So any of these groups you start reading, and I mentioned what those groups were in that presentation, any of the groups you start reading, and you'll find that it would begin with the first phase of the mission described or the second one. Sometimes it begins with the second one, and then the third, and then the fourth, and then the fifth. There's only one group that talks about the sixth one as well. So, I mean, unless you are aware of this reality, you cannot do complete justice. Well, we cannot do, can never do complete justice. But you would be really able to genuinely understand the Quran, and you would know how exactly is this whole text flowing, how is it moving towards its goals. So to understand this particular aspect of the Quranic presentation is extremely important. If you don't understand it, you know what's going to happen? You will expect the Quran to give you direct guidance in your own personal matters. And at times you'll find you'll be disappointed that it's not happening. And then, well, then several problems might erupt, happen. And obviously it's going to be confusing. Allow me to say, you will be disappointed. You will not be impressed. This is what has happened to Muslims. That is why Muslims have resorted to some other sources and given them more importance than the Quran, because honest to God, they have not understood it. I mean, if you don't understand certain passages of the Quran, you say, why is the Almighty mentioning all this? What has it to do with us? What is the relevance? You will find that the entire Quran is completely relevant to the prophetic mission, wherein he warned the people of his nation, and then they ultimately, going through the different phases, they reached their ultimate climax, culmination. So that is another important precondition which you must satisfy in order for you to be able to understand the Quran properly. Fourth precondition. 1, 2, 3, and fourth. The fourth precondition is that the Quran is Al-Furqan, the criterion. This is what the Quran itself says. Right? Sometimes the Quran calls itself Al-Quran, the message that is read out. Sometimes the Quran calls itself Az-Zikra, a reminder. And sometimes the Quran calls itself Al-Furqan, the criterion. I'll tell you what it is. For instance, there is a surah called Al-Furqan, surah number 25. It begins by saying, Tabarakallazi nazzal al-Furqana ala abdihi. Blessed is the one who revealed Al-Furqan on his servant. That is the Quran. What is it? What does it mean? It means that it is the criterion. And what does that mean? Well, that means that it is the source that distinguishes clearly right from wrong. If there is any matter that you face regarding religion, which source should be given the right to dictate as the ultimate authority? It is the Quran. If you don't appreciate it, you will not understand the Quran. You will not be able to do justice with the Quran. So this reality has been described in the Quran, for instance, in a verse, not just the Quran, all books of the Almighty. In verse 213, 213 of Surah Al-Baqarah, the Almighty says that the reason why the Almighty, why he revealed books was لِيَحْكُمَ بَيْنَ النَّاسِ فِي مَخْتَلَفُوا فِي, so that he should decide amongst people in matters where they disagreed. What matters? political matters, matters that have to do with culture, with sports. No, religious matters. Wherever there is a religious dispute, it is the Quran and only the Quran that should be given the right, the authority to decide as to what is the right answer. That is what the Quran claims about itself. You don't want to accept this claim, you will not get the understanding of the Quran. Uh, therefore, there are certain realities which proceed, corollaries of this principle. One is that it is a clear book. I mean, if it is not a clear book, how can it decide about religious matters? I mean, you say that, okay, it's a great book, but you know what? We're not understanding it. It's not giving us a clear message. So, I mean, it had to be a clear book, and it indeed is a clear book. So the Quran makes this mention over and over again. For instance, in Surah number 44, Surah Ad-Dukhan, it says, Hamim wal Kitab al-Mubin. This clear book, this book that clarifies, is an evidence of the fact that it's from God. So it is clear. Another important corollary that we can draw from the fact that it's Al-Furqan is that it's a book of Muslim unity. If at all ever the dream of Muslim unity could ever become accomplished, it was first accomplished during the time of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. He was there. He was the messenger of the Almighty, and everybody was required to be obedient to him. Obviously, Muslims were united. But when he left this world, what would cause Muslims to come together? Quran. That is why the Quran says itself most clearly in Surah Al-Imran, Surah number 3, verse 103. وَاعْتَصِمُوا بِحَبْلِ اللَّهِ جَمِيعًا, and hold fast to the rope of Allah, all of you together. وَلَا تَفَرَّقُوا, and do not break into sects, groups, religious groups. So if there could be a source that would ensure that Muslims are united, it is the Quran. Why? Because it's the ultimate authority. So if you have a dispute with me on religious matters, we'll start talking through the Quran. What exactly is the truth? Maybe you'll still disagree, but we'll continue to search from the Quran and find the answers. Nothing else. Nothing from history. No individual. Nobody. Hadith is to be understood in the light of the Quran. What has happened, unfortunately, is that many people, they think that the Quran has to be understood in the light of Hadith. My goodness. So you have just completely changed the sequence. It's upside down. No, it's the Quran, which is the authority. That is what the Quran mentions itself. Also, the Quran is the criterion, not just for the Muslims. It is a criterion that would let us know what is correct and what is not in the earlier books as well. The Quran describes itself as muhaiminan alayhi. It is supervisor, monitor, or whatever, over all other books. The earlier books were not preserved in their pure, pristine form as the Quran has been done. Why? Did the Almighty not like those books quite as much as the Quran? No, this is the kind of stuff that some emotionally charged Muslims would say. But God is fair. I mean, his policies never change. In the earlier times, the books were not preserved fully because the prophets were coming. If there was anything that was added to the book which didn't belong to it, a new prophet would come and inform people, like Jesus Christ, Isa alayhi salam did, and many others. But once it was decided that no further prophets are going to come, then it was absolutely essential that this book be fully preserved. So now this book is a criterion to decide what is right from what is wrong in what's there in the earlier books as well. And the Quran does it. I'll just give you one or maybe two examples. One example is a simple example, interesting example. In the Bible is comprised of two components, the Old Testament and the New Testament. I call it the pre-Jesus Testament and the post-Jesus Testament. The Old Testament is the pre-Jesus Testament, before Jesus Christ. Its first 5 books are generally considered as Torah. It's not correct, but the general understanding is this. They are described as Pentateuch. The very first book is the book of Genesis. And right at the beginning of the book of Genesis, the Almighty, so it is claimed, it said that he created the heavens and the earth in 6 days, and he rested on the 7th day. Right? The Quran, in a very subtle, and allow me to say in a very decent way, just pointed out that in Surah number 50, verse 38, that the Almighty is the one who He created the heavens and the earth in 6 days. And we didn't get tired. See, fatigue did not catch us, which really means he didn't need to rest. What are you talking about? I mean, that he rested on the 7th day. But another interesting relationship between the Quran and the earlier book, many of them are there, is call it a positive mention in the Quran about what's there in the Bible. In Surah Al-Araf, the 7th Surah, verse 133, the Almighty is talking about the calamities that visited Pharaoh and his nation. They took different forms. The Quran just mentions their titles. At-Tufan wal-Jarad wal-Qummala wal-Dafadiya wal-Dama, and says, Ayatim Mufassalat. These are the signs that have been described in detail. Mufassalat. Where? No mention. So there are a few calamities whose titles have been pointed out, and then it said that they have been described. And they actually have been described in the Old Testament. So what you find is that in the Old Testament, in the book of Exodus, one of the 5 books, in chapter 9, 10, 8, 9, and 10, a detailed description of flood, locusts, lice, frogs, blood, and many more. So in other words, what the Quran mentions in brief, the Bible mentions in more detail, and the Quran points it out, again, in a very subtle way. They have already been described. So I don't want to go into the details of them. If you want, read my earlier book. I mean, I'm just trying to bring out what is not mentioned. It's as if it's quite obvious, implied. So that's the 4th condition. Today we talked about 2 more prerequisites. One is that we must understand and appreciate that the Quran is Sarguzashte Inzar, the saga of the messenger's mission of warning his nation, from A to Z. And then the Quran is Al-Furqan. It is the ultimate authority in religious matters.